This topic has specifically interested me because, for a while actually, because there are a lot of laws we'll find in the Talmud and throughout Jewish history where certain punishments will be executed and they do not conform with standard legal procedures in Jewish law. The reason this is important is because when somebody would want to punish someone or do something for political reasons, and it does not and it's important, but doesn't conform with standard Jewish procedure, this is the only way we could use it. So the example was given before I gave the class regarding the death penalty for extreme cases like terrorists in the state of Israel. I will not be speaking about politics. I generally don't like to do that because I believe 90% of the question when it comes to political issues are not the halacha, it's rather the person's perception of the political climate. So I do not want to discuss that, especially since when it comes to that specific question, some of the main considerations are not Makin Veonshin. For example, Rav Goren believed that it can even be categorized as self-defense. Many other rabbis do not believe that to be accurate. But very often, for example, the execution of extreme cases, like maybe Eichmann, or maybe even terrorists, could be defended using this clause. I will not be discussing that in today's class, since I believe that would be a political question, not the halachic question. That being said, after my class, if you feel like it would apply, you can make that comparison yourself.
Just quickly, very quickly on.
Yes.
In the most extreme cases,
Yes.
a fair trial process still be required?
In extreme cases. So that's a very good question, and we'll address I'll actually bring my clock. So what I was thinking of doing is I'll do a 50-minute class and a 10-minute Q&A. I believe the Q&A at the end is actually more important than the actual class, since I can't address what you're thinking, because I don't know what you're thinking. But I believe the most general questions will be addressed throughout my class. The first part of the class, I will be discussing the main Talmudic precedent, and from before the Talmud, so even from biblical times, and from more modern times, mainly predating Shulchan Aruch. Second part, I'll be discussing laws which were instituted, either all agree or many rabbinic authorities believe to be under this clause. And the third, I'll be discussing the theology and philosophy behind the law, including guidelines and rules as to who can execute this. And I believe that would be what you're referring to. Are there guidelines and laws as to how this can be executed? So what I found, I'll just do a quick abstract before I start the class, is that what I'll be focusing on mainly today is the death penalty, but not only the death penalty, and mainly on the evolution and how the evolution of ethics and morals when applying this principle. So some of these stories we'll be seeing are a bit ethically challenging, and no one today would dream of doing such a thing. The important part for me is the principle that allowed them to do this in Jewish law, to defend that. Second of all, to understand the times have changed, but the principle doesn't change. So how we apply it in today's day and age is an important one. I believe this also shows an interesting nuance you find specifically in Orthodox Judaism, where we believe the laws do not change, yet we do believe circumstances and times have changed. And very often with certain laws, you'll have an interesting balance where you have to make the laws work with the realities of the time, and the law itself gives space for it. And this goes also to be more lenient, also to be more strict. So the fact that we can't drive a car on Shabbat would be a good example, because the Talmud doesn't say don't drive a car on Shabbat. We apply the laws to the current circumstances. And I believe this topic is a very good illustration of such a point. So I'll start with the very first precedent in the Talmud, which is found in Sanhedrin 46a. I'm not going to be reading out most of the source sheets on the source sheet. Maybe here and there a phrase. The reason I printed them out is so that people can see it themselves for context. The Talmud over there, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov said that he heard. Actually, this phrase is quoted in many different Talmudic sources. So it's quoted in the Talmud in Yevamot and in Sanhedrin. It's also quoted in the Jerusalem Talmud. It's also found in Zohar Chadash, Midrash Rut, and it's even found in the earliest source is Megillat Ta'anit. And in all the sources, there are slight variations, but it's the same general principle. The earliest source would be Megillat Ta'anit. That is a Megillah from the time of the Tanaim, which is the rabbis from the Mishnah, they collected a list of days which you're not supposed to mourn on because they are days of festivity and holidays. But they're not like Rosh Hashanah or Sukkot. They're less important holidays, but they're usually like a victory or something of that nature. So the primary source as far as halacha is concerned is from the Talmud in Sanhedrin, but I will mention the slight variations as they're important. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov heard that the Beit Din, the Jewish court, they can hit, they can administer lashes, and they can carry out the capital punishment, even when Torah does not regulate it. And he adds a clause, this is only to build a fence around the Torah, not to argue with the Torah. The Talmud then proceeds by bringing two examples, and these two examples are found in all the above mentioned sources, again with slight variation. The first one is of one who rode a horse on Shabbat, which is only a rabbinic violation. The Torah does not forbid riding a horse on Shabbat. This is a rabbinic violation. Nonetheless, they stoned him to death. This was in the time of the Greeks, as the Talmud points out. The reason that's important is that in the time of the Greeks is because they put a lot of laws against the keeping of Torah, and actually specifically Shabbat was one of the things they had a problem with. So to defend the religion was at some sort of an existential threat, and him in public violating the Shabbat, even if it wasn't a biblical law, they deemed it necessary to carry out such a heavy punishment as the death penalty. The second story the Talmud quotes is of a man who had inappropriate sexual behavior with his wife in public. Well, again, that would not be a Torah violation. It would just be tzniut, promiscuity. Nonetheless, they felt like they could flog him, and in certain sources, quoting this Talmud, they had a different version of the Talmud. Rabbi Reuven Margaliot, a contemporary rabbi, pointed out that in certain teshuvot, responsums of earlier rabbis, when they quote this Talmud, they write that he had this affair, they had this relation with his wife in inappropriate places, and they killed him for it. So in the Talmud, the way we have it, it says they flogged him. There are some cases where they killed him. Similarly, in the Zohar, it says that he kissed a married woman, so it's a different story, similar but different story, and over there also it says that they put him to death for this. So this is the main Talmudic precedent. This was just an introduction to my class. What I'm going to start with the first third of my class is just discussing a few examples of absolutely fascinating sentences carried out by the Talmud, and similar to these sentences we'll find throughout history. The first one is of someone who hits others habitually. So it's not just that he hits him once, he hits others habitually. So the Talmud is a discussion about this, and the Rav Huna says, I actually believe they should cut his arm off. The logic seemingly being that he uses his arm to hit others. If you cut it off, you've prevented him from hitting others. I would argue this is a bit of a medieval rationale. The Talmud then continues and cites a story where he actually did this. Now, the Yad Ramah, a earlier commentary on the Talmud, does quote an opinion who believes this was a monetary punishment, and they didn't actually cut his arm off. However, I would argue the majority of rabbis do understand this to be something that he actually physically did. There is no such law in Jewish court procedures that you should be able to do to cut off someone's arm. This was obviously an extra-legal measure that the court felt was necessary. What I find fascinating about this is that this even leaves legal precedent till today. In the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, it says regarding someone who hits his wife habitually, that they should put communal pressure upon him to achieve whatever they want to, so divorce or whatever it is. It doesn't say they can cut his arm off. Nonetheless, the Vilna Gaon, one of the main commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, who cites the sources for the different rulings, cites this Talmudic passage as a source for the fact that they can put communal pressure on him, even although the example of cutting off his arm is not mentioned in Shulchan Aruch. The fact that in the Talmud they gave space to an extra legal measure, so the contemporary extra legal measure would be putting communal pressure. Nonetheless, this would be the Talmudic source for such a ruling. Similarly, in the Shulchan Aruch Harav was a contemporary of the Vilna Gaon, or the commentary Shulchan Aruch, also regarding a man that hits his wife, writes a different punishment and follows up with this Talmudic ruling. This as a precedent for extra legal measures is seemingly the importance of the Talmudic passage, not the actual execution of this specific punishment. Nonetheless, we do find rabbis who cited this as a precedent for this actual execution. So an example for this would be Yehuda ben Asher. Rabbi Yehuda ben Asher was the son of the Rosh, Asher ben Yechiel, and he wrote a responsa Zichron Yehuda. Over there was a very interesting story where a man, he went to court and the judge ruled against him, and the man was very upset about the ruling. He then went on the way, the rabbi was on his way to pray Arvit in the synagogue, and then on his way to the synagogue, he hit him, and then a second time he hit him, he took off his beard, even cut his lip. The local community were furious. They didn't have legally acceptable witnesses. They nonetheless wanted to put him to death. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Asher said you cannot put him to death for such a violation. He says, however, the lack of kosher witnesses is not a massive caveat. He argued that you could still punish him under this clause of Makin Veonshin Shalom min adin. Extra legal measures can be taken, and he suggests perhaps to cut off his arm. This way, he won't hit others, citing this Talmudic source. So it's not just in the Talmud that we'd find such a punishment. Even in the 14th century, such a punishment was carried out. Similarly, his father, in two responsums, has a similar thinking. In one, which is also quoted here in source number 2, Asher ben Yechiel, his father the Rosh, in which the local community got very upset about a man who was taken ransom. It's a long story there, and he cursed out his God. He cursed out God and the king, and the local authorities were very upset about this. So again, the community wanted to put him to death, which Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel said you cannot. However, he felt that there was a problem, as this could make the Jewish religion look less strict about these laws, as the local authorities would have put him to death. And also, this could have created a massive problem with more people doing such violations. Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel suggests you can cut his tongue off. This way, he will not. He even adds that we get to see justice. This is well-known sort of justice that we see with our eyes each day. A very interesting sentiment from Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel. Similarly, we find examples of executions which the form of execution we don't find in any sort of Jewish law. Like, for example, in source number 3, there's a person who, if they found witnesses he killed someone, they should put his eye out. So the official punishment would be murder. He didn't feel comfortable with murder, so he said they should blind him. Another example is where the whole consideration is a extra legal consideration. So somebody would be doing something which is legally permitted, and they would still punish him. That would be in source number 4, where there was a man who was so lovesick. This is in the Talmud, in Sanhedrin 75. He was so lovesick, the doctors believed he could die if he won't have any sense of intimacy with this specific woman. The Talmud has an opinion that this woman might have even been single, making there no legal violation for them to have any connection. And the doctors even suggested that they should talk behind a fence. They won't even see each other, where there is clearly no violation of law. And nonetheless, the rabbis felt like this should not happen, and as a consequence, he would die. And one of the reasons in the Talmud for this is so that the daughters of Israel should not be promiscuous. This rationale is not a fully acceptable legal rationale, especially if it will lead to someone dying. This is obviously an extra legal measure. I will cite 2 more examples of such stories that happened. One in the Talmud, in the Mishnah, it's discussing the laws of hanging, which you cannot hang, especially women, as a means of punishment. The Talmud says, but Shimon ben Shattach did this. He hung 80 women in one day, which is an outrageous number of people to hang in one day. Jewish law says you can't even kill 2 people in one day, which is what the Mishnah responds to. Well, you can't even execute 2 people in one day. The maximum amount of death penalty for a court is 1 execution in a day. The Jerusalem Talmud cites a very interesting story. It's actually a very funny story regarding this incident, where he was running to be the ruler, and he promised to get rid of all witches. So they've managed to prove that these people are witches. They asked them to take their eyeballs out and put it in their hand. It's a very funny story. The point is, at the end of the Talmud, after they've managed to successfully prove that they are witches, they hanged 80 women in Ashkelon. The Jerusalem Talmud explained that this was not a legal measure. This was an extra legal measure because the hour needed it. These were all the Talmudic examples I will cite. And again, as mentioned above, we'll find these instances cited amongst later rabbis until today. as precedent for the fact that we do carry out extralegal measures, even to kill people at times. I'll later get into it whether or not we could apply this to murder or not. I'll also like to mention that you'll find in the Bible many times sources of extralegal measures being carried out. I cited here my personal favorite one, although there are many others to pick from. In Shmuel Bet, David meets this young man, and this young man admitted to having killed Saul. David therefore decides to execute him for murder, stating, "Your own mouth testified against you." Now, it's a well-known law in Jewish law that self-incriminating evidence is not acceptable, especially for the death penalty, but for any penalty other than monetary law. This led rabbis, including Maimonides and many other earlier rabbis, to explain that this was not a legal measure, this was an extra-legal measure that David carried out. So that's the first part of my class. So I just wanted to cite examples where we do find extra-legal measures in the Talmud. I would like to mention that this does not mean that we, killing 80 people one day because we believe they're witches, or I'm not even saying the story historically happened, or necessarily not saying it's okay. All that's relevant to our class is the precedent for such things, for using the law of extra-legal measures and applying this principle, for that having Talmudic and biblical precedents. That's all that relevant. I will discuss the ethical element of this in the third part of my class. I'd like to move on from here to source number 7, which would be laws which are required and instituted, implemented, using the logic of Makin Veonshin Shalom min Adin. Rabbi Shlomo ibn Aderet, who was a 14th century rabbi, quoted the Talmud in Baba Metzia, where it says that Jerusalem was destroyed because they did not go lifnim mishurat adin, rather they didn't go beyond the law, rather they kept strictly to the law. He applied this to extra-legal measures, saying, without implementing extra-legal measures, the world will be ruined and desolate. He believed it would create some sort of anarchy. His logic being that no set of laws can apply to every case in every situation. Therefore, if you always apply the law strictly, there'll be lawlessness, there'll be anarchy, and everyone will do whatever they feel like it. And therefore, it's important to implement extra-legal measures.
Sorry, I know I missed the first couple of minutes, but what can you just remind me what you mean when you say extra-legal measures?
Extra-legal measures are laws which are not, which do not conform to standard legal procedures in Jewish law, but nonetheless they are permissible if the hour need it, if it's important in the situation. And now we're discussing logic to it, as the set law can't apply to every situation. There's an importance in extra-legal measures being placed in when such a thing is required. So the examples we've cited so far were either of the actual execution not being a legal execution, like cutting someone's arm off, or the sin or crime committed shouldn't be a punishable offense, like we mentioned earlier, violating a rabbinic law, as well as evidence which is not acceptable, like a man testifying about himself is not valid testimony. Nonetheless, we can execute a punishment for any of these, or even if two of these elements are involved in a case, since the hour and time require it.
And are you going to define at any point what?
So earlier we were asked about the regulation of such thing. Does that mean that the judge can do whatever he wants forever, and will always say, well, it was an actual legal measure, right? So there's a threat of corruption involved if a court can just do whatever they want to. So now I'll go on to my second part of my class. This should be a shorter part of my class. I'll just cite examples of laws in the Talmud where we see laws which don't conform with standard legal procedures. Nonetheless, they became set laws for certain violations under this clause. The first one is a Mishnah, and it's called in Hebrew the kippah, the dome punishment. We find this in mainly two main places we find this. One of them is regarding someone who keeps violating very heavy sins and gets punished for it, but he keeps a repeat offender, so the standard law wouldn't help him. And the second one is someone who commits murder, and we can prove with certainty that he did commit the murder, but due to legal technicalities, he cannot be punished. And both of these things pose a serious threat to the religion as whole or to society, mainly the latter. The punishment we find in the Mishnah for such a thing is putting them in a thin dome and feeding them barley. That way they die. Many commentaries explain the logic for such a punishment being that while we cannot execute a death penalty, technically they die on their own, memela or me'elav. So while we border about, this is a Talmudic thinking, this is already in the Mishnah. So the Ran, for example, writes this. So while we cannot formally do the death penalty, since we don't have the Sanhedrin, the High Court, which operates with biblical semicha ordination, rabbinic ordination, so we cannot carry out the death penalty. They technically did not carry out the death penalty since they didn't actively kill him. This is a logic we find in some of the Talmudic commentaries, starting from the Ran. As it happens, Rabbeinu Nisim, the Ran, did not believe this to be extra legal measure. The majority of rabbis do understand this to be an extra legal measure. Rabbi Reuven Margaliot, a contemporary rabbi, cited many sources for such a thing, as well as Professor Menachem Malon in an article he wrote regarding this law, also defended the position and citing many sources from earlier rabbinic sources dating back to the 12th, 13th century, that this is an extra legal measure. While we can prove for certainty that someone committed a sin, we would normally not punish them for this sin. The exception is in murder, specifically where we apply this punishment. Maimonides explains this in Mishneh Torah, in the Yad HaChazakah, that the reason this applies to murder, while there might be other punished sins which are heavier than the sin of murder, nonetheless, it's only murder that poses such a great risk and threat to society if it goes unpunished. So therefore, this only applies to murder. I'll bring another 2 or 3 examples of laws which are implemented, which are, I think, obviously not straightforward laws, rather seemingly extra legal measures or of the sort. One of them would be the law of stereotyping. This one I particularly like. I also find it a bit troubling, this law. Shepherds in the time of the Talmud, they would steal. They wouldn't just steal, they lived from theft. As shepherds of domesticated animal would graze, they would take their sheep to graze in other people's fields, and they would be paid for shepherding, and they just take all the animals and they would use other people's fields to feed the animals. Now, you technically cannot convict someone of a crime for being a shepherd, as that would be stereotyping, which is obviously not a fair legal punishment. Nonetheless, we find Talmudic precedent that if they're already in harm's way, do not save them. And the rationale seems to be something along the lines of the world is better off without them. This is obviously not a standard legal ruling, as it would be stereotyping, mainly would be stereotyping, as well as the violation would only be a rabbinic violation.
That would be like similar to today's used car dealers.
I'm not aware of that stereotype, but very possibly.
Yeah.
Today's what?
Used car dealers. No? Everyone.
Well, stereotyping is that they steal cars.
That they're dishonest. They're like a stereotype. They're dishonest.
As it happens, it's seemingly a dispute. It is seemingly a dispute between the Tosfot and Maimonides, early commentaries on the Talmud, whether or not this is an extra legal measure or not. Tosfot, cited by the commentaries and Shulchan Aruch Siftei Kohen, believe that this is an extra legal measure. The Khatam Sofer, however, points out that the Maimonides would probably not agree with this, and that is also cited by the Shulchan Aruch itself. The wording is from Maimonides, which yes.
Sometimes you mentioned about a debate about whether it is extra legal measurement or it's not.
Right.
Defined actually, what will be the what's the difference? Whether it is extra legal or it's not.
As far as halacha l'maisa goes, as far as the law would go, there might be many significances whether it is or it isn't. As far as as far as my class goes today, it would be more of a theological issue, where I'm trying to bring out a point. In the third part of this class, I'll try to bring out a point, how we see the extra legal measures are evolving to become more ethical as time is going on. So as far as that goes, that would be very relevant. In this specific case, an interesting example would be, is that the Tosfot writes that this cannot be a standard legal measure, as they're only considered thieves on a rabbinical level, for whatever reason it is. So they're only pasul edut. They're only that we don't accept their testimony on a biblical level. We would accept their testimony, making them thieves or on a rabbinic level. I'm not sure if a theft would be only rabbinic, but them as individuals being thieves would be on a rabbinic level. Maimonides, who does not believe this to be an actual legal measure, might believe that it's actually a biblical violation. So very important would be if someone comes to testify in court and they would say, actually, this guy's a shepherd. Would we say, well, we don't accept their testimony since they're a shepherd? Would we say, well, on a biblical level, we do accept them, and for many things, it's enough if they're witnesses on a biblical level. Many people believe for a woman to get remarried, it's enough for the witness to be kosher on a biblical level. So that would be an interesting topic to get into. Maybe an extra 10 minutes after the class, I would want to address some of these halachic significances. Also, very significant would be today. So I'll give an example. It's a bit off topic, but I feel like it's interesting. So maybe I'll address it now, and maybe I'll address it further. The Khatam Sofer, actually the Divrei Chaim is a better example for this. I'll discuss both of them now. The Khatam Sofer discusses that this law isn't because they're thieves. It's because their whole life is from theft. Which means if someone habitually steals, they're still not the same as a shepherd. If someone's whole life and income is from active theft, such a person poses a bigger threat to society as a whole, such profession. An individual who's a shepherd that we have reason to believe is not like that might be different. So an example for this would be the Divrei Chaim also, this was the Khatam Sofer, who says it can be any sin. It doesn't have to be theft. It can be any sin that affects society at whole, and they do it on a consistent basis, and they live from such a thing. I have a hard time seeing an example of something other than theft. The Divrei Chaim was the rabbi from Tzanz. Today's Tzanz dynasty are following his. He wrote a book called Divrei Chaim, Response to Divrei Chaim. So he applied it to any sin, doesn't have to be that of theft. So we see this idea that it's not just that a group of people would steal, it's that it's a profession that categorically live and make their income based on the sin of theft. That's what his problem is. But again, the troubling part here isn't necessarily what their sin is in the punishment, it's the stereotyping of an individual, which cannot be acceptable in court of law. Rabbi Yosef Engel, a contemporary rabbi, also a Polish rabbi, used this, as well as others, use this as an example that we can implement laws on a consistent basis, applying the law of Makin Veonshin, even although a specific punishment can only be carried out on an ad hoc, temporary basis. Nonetheless, we see that certain laws can be implemented on a consistent basis. Even those that do disagree with this, for example, the Maharitz Chayus, who was a major rabbi, an Ashkenazi rabbi, also similarly wrote that he believed it only applies on a temporary basis, but as long as the consideration would apply, this would apply. The Mishnah discussing when someone's in harm's way, you don't save them. The term is if someone's in a pit, don't put them in a pit, but if they're already there, don't take them out of a pit. A similar Talmudic phrase in the same context is, you can even lower them into a pit. An example for this would be a Moser, as well as many other examples, an informer. An informer poses a threat to society, as he can inform on someone to local authorities or any anti-Semitic authority that are going to end up punishing the individual. This poses a great threat to society at whole. An individual who has committed Mesira, who has informed on others, should not be punished. However, if someone makes a habit out of this as consistently informing on others, this was very relevant, unfortunately, throughout Jewish history, where people on a consistent basis were a threat from people informing on others. So Maimonides, for example, cites that in many countries they do kill or cause the death of these people. The law of the Talmudic phrase of putting them into a pit, not just you don't take them out of it, even place them in a pit, also can be understood as extra legal measures by many, while it is a dispute. Some go as far as to say that you can't directly kill them. Placing them in a pit is similar to placing them in the doom discussed earlier, since their death is natural. An example for this in Shulchan Aruch would be removing a ladder while they're in the pit. So the Shulchan Aruch says not to do this, since it's going to create uncomfort with other nations that can lead to anti-Semitism. But in general, these laws of throwing them into a pit serve as a safeguard. Two notable examples for this would be the Chazon Ish, a contemporary rabbi who is very authoritative in Jewish law, as well as Reb Chaim from Brisk, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, who is quoted in Encyclopedia Talmudit to have had the same position, that since it's only for safeguarding society as a whole, you always have to measure the benefit from such a law and the threat from such a law. So if you'll end up lowering people in a pit, and that's going to grow more resentment than it's going to gain, then we haven't gained anything by such a punishment. He actually believed often kindness is a better solution for problems. The Chazon Ish, I'm saying, I don't think Reb Chaim Soloveitchik said this, but the Chazon Ish writes that if you're kind to people, there's more of a chance of them being nice to you than if you punish people from their category to death. I'll bring one or two more examples very quickly for such laws implemented. One is the example of an experienced robber, a Talmudic story, which we find in Baba Kama 96b, where a person stole an ox, used it, and returned it. Legal law would require him not to have to pay back any of the benefits which he gained from having stolen it, since he returned the ox. Yet since he's done this more than once, he's a repeat offender, Rav Nachman felt like he could penalize him. And he penalized him to pay half of the profit from what he gained from having stolen the ox. Another example is, in Jewish law, the proof always rests upon the claimant. So if I take someone to court and I want to take money from him, I have to prove my case. There was an instance in the Talmud, it's also brought down in Shulchan Aruch, of a violent man. This would be like a mafia boss or something of that nature, where people are scared to testify against him. We require that man to bring the witnesses to testify against him, since if the claimant will try bringing them, they'll be scared to testify. We also find a similar sentiment.
Can you just explain how that works for a second?
What do you mean by?
What do you mean you require him to?
Right. So normally, if let's say there are two witnesses, and the defendant comes to court, says that I don't know, Joe can testify on my behalf, but he's afraid to come to court since I'm suing such a famous person or such an influential or powerful person. The court will turn to that influential person, tell him that you have a responsibility now to bring that person to testify to court. The details of how this would play out obviously can change from different time to time. So if let's say he'll bring him to court, and then the person, so Talmud for example asks, how does it help if you bring him to court? He's just going to lie in court because he's scared of the person. So Talmud says the person has enough integrity to not commit to a double problem. He won't come, but once he's already brought to then also lie, he has enough integrity to not do that. So I'm assuming as times move on, we can have, like in America now, we have options where people can testify and be anonymous. And there are different solutions. I'm assuming Jewish law would also evolve to suit the best solution. But the idea is that we can penalize the violent man, the powerful man, since they're scared to testify against him, and he bears some responsibility for such a thing. We find such sentiments in the Talmud also, regarding, for example, Talmud in Baba Batra 48b, Yevamot 110, and Ketubot 86a. There's two instances we find such a idea. This would be in source number 13. One regarding forcing someone to accept a proposal to some degree, and then that person ends up accepting it. We penalize him by undoing that marriage. Similarly, we find regarding someone avoiding cash by giving it to someone, that way he can't pay back his debtors. The Talmud says since he acted improperly, the rabbis acted improperly with him. This is the second part of my class, and here the third part of my class, which is really the point I'm trying to get to, would be the ethical considerations and the regulation of this law. I would like to start by pointing out that while we've discussed all these sentences from the Talmud regarding these laws, most of these laws, when they're cited in later rabbis, are for significantly lighter punishments, and they're only cited as examples for extra legal measures being introduced. An example I mentioned earlier was when the Talmud, it says to cut off someone's arm. This can be used as precedent for placing communal measures, communal pressures onto someone to achieve the same means. Another example I mentioned earlier was in the Talmud. We believed that someone could be put to death, or at least you can cause his death. The Chazon Ish writes that the best way of achieving that same means is by being kind to people and not by punishing them. Extra-legal measures pose a great threat of corruption. So there's a certain paradox here. While there's a serious need for extra-legal measures, there's also a threat of corruption by giving them the ability to do this. The Avnei Nezer was a contemporary rabbi. He was the rabbi of Sachachov. He used the phrase that when someone judges extra-legal measures, he cannot be mistaken and he cannot be wrong, since as he wishes he can rule, and that would be the correct law. We'll see soon that that might not be entirely accurate according to all rabbis. Nonetheless, we see that there does seem to be a great threat involved with extra-legal measures being introduced. We see a similar paradox with monetary law, where the point of a judge is to judge honestly and fairly, and the pursuit of the truth is really the essence. The only reason you have laws and witnesses to regulate how we get to the truth. Therefore, there's a law that if the judge sees something to be true, or something, even although, let's say, you don't have witnesses, or you don't have the legally sufficient requirement to pass a judgment, nonetheless, the court does have a right to sentence a ruling based on insufficient evidence. This is in the Shulchan Aruch and in the Maimonides. This already has earlier sources than that. However, they continue by citing that since courts become more corrupt and less knowledgeable, we no longer do this. So today almost all courts, he writes, have agreed to only judge based on the books. Rabbi...
Is that referred to monetary only? Or?
That's only monetary law. Yeah, you can't punish someone without sufficient evidence. However, the Shvut Yaakov, Rabbi Jacob Reischer, was a major post-Shulchan Aruch rabbi, disagreed with the Shulchan Aruch on this, and he believed that since today we're less knowledgeable, it's more important for judges to rule extra-legally, since we won't always get the ruling right, and it won't always end up being fair. To some degree, I believe they would both agree that you do need extra-legal measures implemented for the upkeep of society. It's just the paradox and the two sides of the coin, and the emphasis on the threat of corruption via the threat of pursuing the truth, is what I'm trying to highlight from this dispute. So on the one hand, you have Maimonides, who is scared of corruption. He will therefore compromise on the truth in some instances. On the other hand, the threat of corruption is being compromised by Jacob Reischer, where he believes that the pursuit of the truth is important, and to some degree he's willing to compromise on the threat of corruption. There's no real way around this without either compromising on this or compromising on that. So I'll give examples now where we see everyone would agree that you do have the right to make at least monetary laws, or even other than that, extra legal measures for upkeep of society. Elected members of the city do have the right to introduce new fines, new laws for the city's sake. So a good example for this would be taxes to build a synagogue. This even goes to punitive measures. Like, for example, there was an instance with Rabbi Meir ben Baruch of Ruthenburg in Teshuvot Maharam, where he believes that a person who hurt another person, he even pulled out a knife as a threat, and he said that you could punish him based on every city has their standard legal measures, and you could apply that, whatever in your city is the legally applied measure. As times change, obviously different needs are implemented. In the Pirkei Avot, the very beginning of Pirkei Avot, it says the men of the Great Assembly said three things, one of them being, make a fence around the Torah. This is in source 16. Naftali Hirtz Wiesel was a very controversial, I don't know if I should call him a rabbi, Jewish thinker in the time when the Masculine started. And he was somewhere in between the Orthodoxy and the Masculine. So he was an Orthodox and observant Jew. However, he was a very controversial figure. And he pointed out something very interesting in his commentary to Pirkei Avot. He wrote that at the time, that was a time when the Divine Spirit, the Ruach HaKodesh, departed from the Jewish people. He therefore believed that the importance of using the extra legal measures became specifically significant then, since that which has been used till then to restore justice was no longer applicable. Rav Kook, one of the major Zionist rabbis of when Israel was being found, explained the importance of such laws being sentenced with integrity. Most laws, when they're being judged, if the person is doing it with the wrong intent or intention, the rules are still fair and just laws. Therefore, he believed that even if the judge does it for the wrong case, it's still a fair legal ruling. However, if a court judges an extra legal measure, if the intent isn't for the sake of heaven and the laws aren't written anywhere, in what way is this court different to just a group of thugs? That's the point he made, which is a very valid point. That's why he points out every time we see extra legal measures being used, almost every time they will add, and this should be done for the sake of heaven. We don't normally find this with normal rulings. When someone asks, this and this happened, should we do this or this? No one will say, well, do it for the sake of heaven, since that's the law. Being and you have this great threat of corruption, that's why there's a specific importance with it being for the sake of heaven. I would also like to address, before I continue this point and this paradox, also was asked earlier regarding regulation. There's a big dispute as to who can sentence such punishments. Individuals do believe that it has to be the Great Sanhedrin, which no longer exists. Others do believe it has to be the king. The overwhelming majority of people believe that even without a king and without the Sanhedrin, it can be. The Ran, for example, Rabbeinu Nissim, an early Talmudic commentary, believed it had to be the king. Rav Kook argued that today a democratically elected government fills the role of a king. This is not in the source sheet. Or is it? I don't think it is. Today the king, this is in Mishpat Kohen 143, 144, he discusses the idea. And he believes that the king's authority was to govern important regulations for the upkeep of a city. He believed that today a democratically elected government, and he was specifically discussing the state of Israel, is legally, as far as the halacha is concerned, as authoritative as back then a king was. So therefore, back then, since a king could have, today a court which has the authority of the state has that same right. Most believe that a bet din, either someone as great as Rav Nachman in his times, or even a city local authority can administer these punishments. Similarly, there's a great dispute as to whether what laws and how this should be regulated. Because of lack of time, I won't get into that, but well, that would have been important. There are disputes whether or not you should keep it as similar as possible to the way the punishment would be under standard law, or should we make it as far as possible so people won't confuse it as if you're doing the standard legal procedure. I'd like to finish by discussing the importance of the death penalty and how how actual legal measures fill the role of the death penalty. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, I'm assuming people over here have heard of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. He was an American contemporary rabbi. He had an interesting letter regarding the death penalty he sent to the officials in New York. In it, he argued we don't carry out the death penalty because we hate the sinner, heaven forbid. He said there are many laws we implement to avoid the death penalty being implemented. He said the death penalty can serve as a means to judge the severity of different sins. We also find the sentiment already by the Maimonides in his commentary to Pirkei Avot in the second chapter, in the beginning, where we see that different sins are represented by how severe they are based on the punishment. So Moshe Feinstein believed, other than extra legal measures for either incredibly evil people or for a state where murder becomes hefker, becomes lawlessness, everyone can feel comfortable with killing, then such a thing could be introduced. But as a punishment for a specific crime, he believed it is not the Jewish position. However, throughout Jewish history, we do find defenses for the capital punishment. A notable example for this would be in source 19, Rav Saadia Gaon, who believed that it serves as a deterrent for future murders and for future sins. Since if you don't implement the death penalty, people will do whatever they want, as there are no repercussions. He says the same way it's fair to amputate a limb on the body to save the body at whole, it's worth killing an individual to not give up on many other people and the whole nation being killed out by lawlessness. To me, it seems as though Rav Saadia Gaon, while he has a point, as time goes on, the problem he's addressed with, the extra legal measures have taken care of that threat. As time goes on, we've got better means and better forms of regulating crimes. So today we have the prison, we've got jail, we've got rehabilitation centers, we've got better understanding of psychologists, what would drive someone to commit certain crimes and violations. So as time goes on, we've got better ways of dealing with the punishment. So today, since we've got so much better options, and as time goes on, only today, even 1,000 years ago, as time goes on, there are different ways of dealing with sins and crimes. That threat that Rav Saadia Gaon was bothered with could be dealt with in better ways than that of the death penalty. Therefore, it's better to regulate these laws using the extra-legal measures, Makin Veonshin clause, rather than using the formal death penalty. Nonetheless, the death penalty still is an important thing to define the severity of different sins. So what Judaism as a whole, as seems to me, has done, we've avoided actually carrying out the death penalty. As the necessity for death penalty, we've refilled with extra-legal measures. Whenever an instance happened that this threat became a problem, we've always dealt with it using this clause of extra-legal measures or other Talmudic sources which are not the formal death penalty. Yet the necessity of the death penalty still serves as the defining factor and anchorage, as defining this sin is so heavy you should be killed for it, while never actually executing the person. We've created a perfect balance. Maimonides, in the Guide to the Perplexed, this would be source 20, is addressing the paradox of changing times. He's not discussing penalties, he's discussing the religion. When it comes to religion, there's essentially a paradox which is unavoidable. If you don't change religion and laws stay forever, then you'll end up having an outdated law, since no certain set of laws or mitzvot can apply to all times equally. Circumstances change, times change. Therefore, if you'll just have the same law and it will never change, you'll end up having a primitive religion for the times. And this is a serious consideration, similar to the consideration paradox we had earlier regarding following the law strictly, and you'll end up not pursuing the truth. On the other hand, you have the same paradox with religion too, where if you change the law, you have a threat. You have a threat of people doubting the authority and the authorship of the Torah, saying it was man-made, as well as a kilkul of the mitzvot. The laws will become man-made, since they will keep being changed as people see fit. There will be basically no value to these laws being religious laws. They will be exactly the same as any democratically elected government making new laws. So the Torah says put on tefillin, we'll just change it. And we see one of these two options in almost any religion or religiously affiliated group, where one of these two problems do seem to fit. Either the religion is compromised, or it doesn't follow up with the times. To avoid this problem, Maimonides writes that the Torah had the perfect solution. On one hand, we're not allowed to add or subtract from the Torah. This way the Torah remains eternal and truth, and no one will ever doubt the authority of the Torah, as well as people will keep them equally. On the other hand, the Bet Din, the Sanhedrin of the time, was given the right to implement changes on an ad hoc basis and to punish extra-legally, avoiding the problem of not fitting to circumstances, where laws can't be changed. However, when our calls for it and when the need, we can introduce on a temporary basis, or even for certain issues on a consistent basis, different laws to avoid the problem that not changing would address. Thereby, we've eliminated the issue of not fitting to the times. What I would like to argue for today, and it seems as though we'll have less time for the Q&A session at the end, but what I'd like to argue today is that when we look at the evolution of the punishments, and the punishments today cited from the Talmud, even from the Bible, and the laws can be extrapolated to modern times, almost every example I cited will be cited in contemporary and later rabbinic authority as precedent for a punishment which is a lot more humane than that which was carried out in the Talmud. We see this contrast perfectly, where we do not believe people can just keep making laws, and it will avoid understanding the importance of the different sins and the importance of how it should be carried out and the sin. Yet we do not carry out the exact same punishment, allowing the legal system to become more ethical and more just as time goes on. This is what I believe to be the authentic Orthodox position on the death penalty. This is what I believe the authentic position to be on the legal system at whole. And I believe this is why we have, or this is how we'll have the most ethical court system possible. And I think I've made my point. And if anyone has any questions, now is a Q&A session.
Can you just, before the question, can you give, like, just so, can you give it like a 2-minute summary to tie the beginning to the end of the class?
Okay, yes, that's a very good idea. Throughout the precedence of extra-legal measures, we found examples of people being punished without adequate testimony, witnesses, proof. We found people being punished in extra-legal measures in the manner that the execution itself wasn't following normative and standard legal procedures, as well as we found people being punished for sins which aren't sins punishable offenses. We found this authority to be given to local authorities almost always when a certain societal issue or problem, whether big or small, one that impacts people as a whole. Even if an individual can be punished, which is disputed, it would be as a threat that others can also act out. There we see that the law allows for certain extra legal measures to be implemented in order to preserve the society. While the official punishments are no longer carried out, they're important since it teaches us how to punish the different sins. They're an anchorage for the severity of different sins, different crimes. Nonetheless, the method of execution would be different and adapt to times since we're using the method of extra legal measures. On a philosophical point, I made the argument that this is similar to that which Maimonides discusses regarding the threat of changing times paradox. Similarly, I connected it to the idea of the threat of corruption in monetary laws vs the threat of not pursuing justice, where we see in these paradoxes where on one hand, if you pursue the truth and try creating an ethical and better improvement with the times, you'll end up losing out on corruption and on the legal system being meaningless. On the other hand, if you don't do that, you have an unethical and unjust and even a primitive set of laws. So both in monetary laws, it seems like we've done some sort of a compromise. And I would argue the same would apply to extrajudicial authority, where you can even put someone to death, which is disputed whether or not someone can use the extra legal measure. Most rabbis believe you could, but even if you could, it would have to be the most ethical consideration, and based on the times, you'd have to choose that. I believe that it's to make a more just legal system. The solution isn't to make more just laws. The solution is to make more just people, raising the standard level of people. Thereby, this extra legal measure will be carried out in an ethical manner, and changing the laws to an ethical standard is not a final solution, since in 20 years from now, that will be considered outdated. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, very good. So there's no, to deal with the corruption issue, there's not really...
There isn't really a perfect solution. It's just, I guess...
there's forget perfect. Let's put perfect solution aside. Is there any solution?
Well, this is not really connected to my class. What ended up happening in Jewish courts is that there's an alternative to judgment, which is called a peshara.